The limestone walls of St. Jude's Cathedral held the chill of 100 winters, a damp, hallowed cold that even the mid-July sun couldn't pierce. Evelyn Vance stood in the small, oak-paneled vestry, her breath hitching every time she caught her reflection in the gilded floor-length mirror. She looked like a stranger to herself. The woman in the mirror was draped in vintage Chantilly lace, a delicate ivory shroud that cost more than her first 3 cars combined. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate crown of braids, pinned with heirloom pearls that had belonged to a grandmother she never knew. She was the picture of a classic bride, the centerpiece of a high society wedding that felt more like a coronation than a private union. "You're shaking, Evie," her sister, Sarah, whispered, adjusting the heavy silk train. "It's just nerves. Every bride has them. Even the ones marrying billionaire architects." Evelyn managed a weak smile. "It's not just nerves. It's the weight of it all. I feel like if I move too fast, the whole dream will shatter." "It's not a dream," Sarah said firmly, squeezing her hand. "Julian is real. The house in Lake Forest is real. And in 20 minutes, your life as a struggling freelance editor is officially over." As Sarah stepped out to check on the flower girls, Evelyn allowed her mind to drift back to the beginning. To the rain. 18 months ago, Evelyn had been standing under a leaky awning on Wacker Drive in Chicago, clutching a saturated portfolio of manuscripts. The city was a gray blur of wind and water, and she was miserable. Then, a black umbrella had tilted over her head, shielding her from the deluge. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," a voice had said. It was a voice like rich mahogany, smooth, dark, and expensive. She had looked up into the eyes of Julian Vane. He wasn't just handsome, he possessed a terrifyingly symmetrical beauty that felt almost sculpted. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with surgical precision. Within 10 minutes, he had bought her a coffee. Within 2 hours, he had convinced her to stay for dinner. Julian was a mystery wrapped in a bespoke blazer. He was an architect, he told her, specializing in high-security private estates. He traveled often, spoke 4 languages with varying degrees of fluency, and possessed an intellect that was both dazzling and intimidating. The only thing missing was a history. "My parents were archaeologists," he had told her over a bottle of vintage Bordeaux on their 3rd date. "They died in a plane crash over the Andes when I was 12. I was raised by a series of tutors and boarding schools in Switzerland. No siblings. No cousins. Just me and the blueprints." At the time, Evelyn had found it romantic, a lonely soul who had finally found his home in her. She didn't mind the lack of a guest list on his side of the aisle. She didn't mind that his friends were mostly business associates who looked like they were on loan from a security firm. She was in love with the way he looked at her, as if she were the only stable structure in a world of shifting sand. A sharp knock on the vestry door pulled her back to the present. It was time. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary swung open, and the first notes of the pipe organ shook the very marrow of her bones. The scent of frankincense and expensive lilies hit her like a physical wave. Evelyn took her father's arm, her fingers digging into his tuxedo sleeve. "You okay, kid?" her father whispered, his eyes watery. "Don't let me trip," she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As they began the long walk down the center aisle, the 300 guests blurred into a sea of pastel fascinators and dark suits. Her focus narrowed to the man standing at the end of the long, red carpet. Julian Vane stood perfectly still. His hands were clasped in front of him, his posture impeccable. The light from the stained glass windows caught the edge of his jaw, casting a shadow that made him look like a saint in a Renaissance painting. He looked peaceful. He looked perfect. But as she stepped onto the marble dais and took his hand, a cold shiver raced up her spine. His palm was ice cold, despite the heat of the cathedral. And for a fleeting second, as he looked past her toward the flickering candles, Evelyn saw something she had never seen in him before. It wasn't love. It wasn't even wedding day jitters. It was a look of intense, calculated vigilance. He wasn't looking at his bride, he was scanning the room, checking the exits, measuring the distance between where he stood and the shadows of the vestry. Father Thomas, the aging priest of St. Jude's, stepped forward. He was a man who looked like he had been carved from the same limestone as the cathedral, wrinkled, gray, and ancient. He had a reputation for being a pillar of the community, a man who had seen every confession and heard every lie. As Evelyn and Julian knelt on the velvet cushions, Father Thomas cleared his throat to begin the invocation. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God." Evelyn looked up at Julian, waiting for him to catch her eye, to give her that reassuring wink that always calmed her down. But Julian remained fixed, his gaze hovering somewhere just above the priest's head. Father Thomas paused. It was a beat too long. A heavy, uncomfortable silence began to pool in the air between them. Evelyn glanced at the priest. Father Thomas was no longer looking at his prayer book. He was staring, no, gaping at Julian. The color was draining from the old man's face, leaving it a sickly, translucent white. His hands, usually steady as he handled the Eucharist, began to tremble so violently that the pages of the Bible fluttered like the wings of a dying bird. Julian's grip on Evelyn's hand tightened. It wasn't a romantic squeeze, it was a warning. His fingers felt like iron bands, pinning her to the spot. "Father," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. The priest didn't answer her. His eyes were locked on Julian's face, tracing the line of his nose, the curve of his brow, the small, nearly invisible scar just below his hairline that Julian had always claimed was from a childhood fall. The air in the cathedral grew heavy, thick with the unspoken. The guests began to stir, a murmur of confusion rippling through the pews. Sarah leaned forward from the front row, her brow furrowed in concern. Evelyn felt the world tilt. She looked at her perfect stranger, the man who had appeared in a rainstorm to save her, and for the first time, she noticed the way his eyes never quite reached a state of rest. She noticed the way he didn't seem surprised by the priest's reaction, he seemed ready for it. The fairy tale was curdling. The lace felt like a shroud, and the lilies smelled like a funeral. Father Thomas took a staggering step back, his hip hitting the heavy altar. He looked like he wanted to run, but his duty held him in place. He looked at Evelyn with a sudden, piercing pity that terrified her more than any scream could have. "The ceremony," Julian prompted, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "Please, Father. Continue." But the priest didn't continue. He looked at the congregation, then back at the man standing in the expensive tuxedo, and the truth began to settle into the room like dust. The silence that filled St. Jude's Cathedral was no longer the reverent hush of a sacred space, it had transmuted into something heavy, viscous, and suffocating, like cooling wax poured over the congregation. The high, vaulted ceiling seemed to shrink, the Gothic arches pressing inward as the seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. Evelyn Vance felt the pulse in her throat hammering against the high lace collar of her gown. She looked from the trembling hands of Father Thomas to the profile of the man she was supposed to marry. Julian's face remained a masterpiece of stoicism, but his grip on her hand had shifted. His thumb was pressed hard against her metacarpals, a grounding technique, perhaps, or a silent command to stay still. Father Thomas looked as though he had seen a ghost rise from the crypts beneath the altar. His eyes, clouded by age but sharpened by decades of listening to the darkest secrets of the human soul, were fixed on Julian with a terrifying intensity. For 40 years, Thomas had been a vessel for the light, but before St. Jude's, he had spent 20 years in the shadow. As a prison chaplain in the Commonwealth of Virginia, he had walked the Green Mile with men who had forgotten the meaning of mercy. He had seen the faces of true predators, those who didn't growl, but smiled. Just last night, in the quiet of the rectory, he had been flicking through the news on his tablet, a rare habit for a man of his vintage. A segment on America's Most Wanted had caught his eye. A cold case. A man known as the Architect, a sociopath who didn't just kill his victims, he dismantled their lives, took their fortunes, and then vanished into the ether, leaving behind nothing but accidental tragedies. The digital sketch on the screen had been hauntingly familiar. But seeing the man in the flesh, illuminated by the kaleidoscopic light of the South Rose window, was a different reality entirely. The jawline, the specific, predatory stillness of the shoulders, and above all, the eyes that didn't reflect light, but absorbed it. "Father!" Julian's voice broke the silence. It was low, resonant, and carried a subtle edge of steel. It wasn't a question, it was an ultimatum. The vows. "We are waiting." The congregation shifted. Evelyn heard the rustle of silk and the quiet cough of an uncle in the third row. To them, this was just a momentary lapse, a senior priest losing his place in the liturgy. But to Evelyn, it felt like the world was beginning to tilt on its axis. Father Thomas didn't pick up the prayer book. His gaze dropped to Evelyn, and for a moment, she saw a flash of pure, unadulterated grief in his eyes. It was the look a doctor gives a patient when the prognosis is terminal. "I cannot," the priest whispered. The words were so faint they were nearly lost to the echoing chamber. "I beg your pardon," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. He took a half step forward, his shadow falling over the priest. From the pews, it looked like a gesture of concern. Up close, it was a move of pure intimidation. "I know who you are," Father Thomas said, his voice gaining a sudden, crystalline clarity that rang out to the first few rows. Evelyn felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her spine. "Father Thomas, what are you talking about?" "Julian is." "Julian Vane does not exist, Evelyn," the priest said, his eyes never leaving the groom's face. "He is a ghost. A construction of lies and stolen identities." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't erupt in anger or try to laugh it off with a charming quip. Instead, his expression underwent a subtle, chilling transformation. The warmth he had projected for 18 months, the tenderness, the vulnerability was pulled back like a curtain, revealing a cold, structural void. "You're confused, Thomas," Julian said. He used the priest's first name without the title, a deliberate stripping of authority. "The heat in this cathedral is excessive for a man of your age. Perhaps we should take a moment in the vestry." It was a brilliant move. To the guests, Julian looked like the concerned son-in-law, managing a senile clergyman. Evelyn felt a flicker of doubt. Was it possible? Father Thomas was nearly 80. Memory was a fickle thing. But then she felt the hand. Julian's grip on her wrist tightened further, his fingernails digging into the delicate skin just above her glove. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the priest with a look of such calculated malice that Evelyn felt her breath catch in her lungs. This wasn't the man who had brought her soup when she had the flu. This wasn't the man who quoted Keats in the rain. This was a stranger. Father Thomas closed his eyes for a second, a silent prayer passing his lips. In his mind, the images from the Most Wanted broadcast merged with his memories of the prison yard in Virginia. The architect. Arthur Sterling. The crimes were meticulous. 3 wives in 3 different states. Each one a woman of independent means, each one accidentally deceased within 2 years of the wedding. One drowned in a shallow pool in Arizona. One died of carbon monoxide poisoning in a luxury cabin in Vermont. The third fell from a balcony in a high-rise in Chicago. The police had never been able to prove foul play because the accidents were engineered with the precision of a master builder. But the FBI had finally connected the dots. The common denominator was always the man who inherited everything. The man who changed his face and moved to the next city before the ink on the death certificate was dry. Arthur, Father Thomas said, the name hitting the air like a physical blow. Julian's jaw tightened. The muscle beneath his ear twitched, the only sign that the name had registered. "My name is Julian," he said, but the conviction was gone. It was a statement of fact, not an emotional plea. The murmur in the congregation had grown into a dull roar of confusion. Evelyn's father stood up from the front row, his face a mask of bewilderment. "What's going on? Thomas, finish the ceremony." Evelyn looked at Julian, her eyes searching for the man she loved, but she found only a hollow shell. She pulled her hand back, and this time, she didn't let him keep it. She stumbled back, the heavy train of her dress tangling around her ankles. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Tell him he's wrong. Tell him you don't know who Arthur is." Julian looked at her then. For a fleeting second, the Julian persona flickered back to life, the soft eyes, the gentle tilt of the head. "He's a confused old man, Evelyn. Don't let him ruin our day. Let's just go. We can find a justice of the peace. We don't need this." "He's not confused," Father Thomas barked, his voice now a roar that commanded the entire room. He reached into the pocket of his robes and pulled out a cell phone, an incongruous sight in the hands of a priest at the altar. "I called the field office 20 minutes ago, Arthur. They're already at the perimeter." The atmosphere in the cathedral shifted from confusion to electricity. Julian's head snapped toward the back of the church. The heavy oak doors were closed, but the sound of distant sirens began to bleed through the stone walls, low and wailing, like the cry of a banshee. "If any person here knows of any reason why these two should not be joined," Father Thomas began, returning to the liturgy with a grim, ironic force. "I speak now. And I tell you, Evelyn Vance, that you are standing at the edge of a grave." Julian didn't wait for the rest. He didn't look at Evelyn one last time, didn't offer an explanation or a plea for forgiveness. He turned, his movements fluid and efficient, and began to head toward the side exit leading to the sacristy. "Stop him!" someone shouted. Evelyn stood frozen in the center of the dais, the white lilies at her feet looking like funeral wreaths. She watched the man she thought was her soulmate transform into a fugitive. The sirens were closer now, a cacophony of blue and red light beginning to pulse against the stained glass, turning the saints on the windows into witnesses of a very different kind of judgment. The wedding was over. The hunt had begun. The transition from a holy sacrament to a crime scene happened in the space of a single heartbeat. It was a pop, the sound of a reality bubble bursting. As the sirens wailed closer, their discordant screams echoing off the ancient stone buttresses of St. Jude's, the man who called himself Julian Vane moved. He didn't scream, didn't panic, and didn't offer a desperate plea of innocence. Instead, he simply shed his humanity. The warmth that had lived in his eyes for 18 months, the look of a man deeply in love, vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating efficiency of a predator who had been cornered. Julian, or Arthur, as the priest had called him, didn't run blindly. He was the architect for a reason. He lived in a world of angles, weight-bearing walls, and points of egress. He took one sharp look at the main entrance, where the heavy oak doors were being rattled from the outside, and then at the high altar. "Evelyn," he said, his voice devoid of all its former melody. It was flat, like a stone hitting water. "Stay where you are. Do not follow me." It wasn't a request, it was a tactical command. He lunged toward the sacristy door, a small, inconspicuous wooden portal to the left of the altar. But Father Thomas, surprisingly spry for his 80 years, moved to block his path. The old priest held nothing but a heavy, brass-bound lectionary, but he stood with the terrifying weight of divine justice. "You won't leave this house of God, Arthur," Father Thomas barked. The man who was Julian didn't hesitate. He didn't strike the priest, but he moved with a terrifying fluid speed, sidestepping the old man and shoving the heavy altar table. The massive piece of furniture, draped in fine linen and bearing the Holy Eucharist, groaned across the marble floor, creating a physical barrier between the priest and the door. "Julian! Stop!" Evelyn found her voice, but it sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone small and frightened and very far away. She reached out, her gloved fingers catching the sleeve of his tuxedo. For a second, he stopped. He turned his head, and for the first time, Evelyn saw him clearly. The man she had slept next to, the man she had planned to grow old with, looked at her with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a specimen. "It's a shame, Evelyn," he whispered. "You were the best design I'd ever drafted." He yanked his arm away, the fine wool of his jacket tearing slightly, and vanished through the sacristy door just as the main entrance burst open. The amens and quiet murmurs of the 300 guests were instantly replaced by the thunder of boots and the barked commands of men with badges. "FBI! Nobody move! Hands in the air!" The sanctuary erupted into a kaleidoscope of chaos. Guests dived under pews, flower girls wailed in terror as their baskets of petals were trampled by tactical boots. Evelyn's father, a man of quiet dignity, was tackled to the floor as he tried to reach his daughter, the agents taking no chances in the confusion. Special Agent Marcus Thorne led the breach. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot, but they were locked onto the altar. He saw Evelyn standing there, a ghost in white lace, looking at her empty hands. "Where is he?" Thorne shouted, leaping over the communion rail. Evelyn could only point toward the sacristy, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "The door," he went through the door. Thorne didn't wait. He signaled to a team of agents who swarmed the side exit like a colony of angry wasps. Evelyn collapsed onto the velvet kneeling cushion. The world felt like it was spinning on a crooked axis. Beside her, Father Thomas sat heavily on the steps, his chest heaving. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it on her shoulder. "I am so sorry, child," he wheezed. "I saw the report only last night. I spent hours praying I was wrong, praying that the man I saw on the screen wasn't the man standing in my parish. But I couldn't let you say I do. I couldn't let you sign your own death warrant." "Death warrant?" Evelyn's voice was a ghost of a whisper. He loved me. We were going to go to Italy. We were going to start a family." "He doesn't love, Evelyn," a new voice joined them. It was Agent Thorne, returning from the sacristy, his face grim. He builds a perfect life, a perfect persona, and a perfect trap. He's been doing it for 15 years. You weren't his wife, you were his latest project. Once the structure was complete, once the insurance policies were signed and the assets were merged, he would have demolished the evidence. Just like he did in Phoenix. Just like he did in Seattle. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea roll over her. She looked down at her engagement ring, a 3-carat diamond that caught the light of the flickering candles. Was it even real? Or was it just another carefully placed piece of the architecture? Through the open sacristy door, the sounds of a struggle began to filter back into the main hall. There was the crash of breaking glass, the heavy thud of bodies hitting wood, and then a series of sharp, metallic clicks. "We've got him. In the bell tower. He's cornered." A voice crackled over Thorne's radio. Evelyn stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of water. Driven by a morbid, desperate need to see the end of the lie, she began to walk toward the door. "Miss Vance, stay back," Thorne warned, but she ignored him. She gathered the heavy skirts of her wedding dress in her arms, the white silk trailing through the dust and the scattered rose petals, and followed the trail of the agents. The path led through the narrow, winding stone stairs of the cathedral's northern tower. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and pigeon droppings. At the top, in the small, cramped belfry where the great bronze bells hung in silent judgment, she saw him. Julian Arthur was pinned against the stone wall. His tuxedo was ruined, covered in soot and grime. One of the agents had a knee in his back, while another was ratcheting handcuffs onto his wrists. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like the man she loved, disheveled and hurt. For a split second, the lie was so strong that Evelyn wanted to scream at the agents to let him go. She wanted to believe Father Thomas was senile, that the FBI had the wrong man, that her life wasn't a smoking ruin. Then, Arthur Sterling turned his head. He saw her standing in the doorway, framed by the light of the setting sun. He didn't look sorry. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored. "You should have worn the veil down, Evelyn," he said, his voice echoing in the small stone chamber. "The lighting up here is terrible for your complexion." The sheer, chilling banality of the comment hit her harder than any confession could have. The man she had loved wasn't just a criminal, he was a void. There was nothing behind the eyes, no regret, no empathy, just a cold assessment of the aesthetics of the moment. As the agents dragged him past her, the narrowness of the stairs forced them to brush against her. Arthur stopped for a fraction of a second. The gold wedding band he had been holding during the ceremony, the one he was supposed to slide onto her finger, slipped from his vest pocket. It hit the stone floor with a high, musical ping. It rolled across the uneven surface, spinning in smaller and smaller circles until it wobbled and died at the toe of Evelyn's white satin shoe. She looked down at the gold circle. It was a symbol of eternity, of a promise that was never a promise at all. "Take him out," Thorne commanded. As they hauled him away, Evelyn sank to her knees on the cold stone of the belfry. The bells above her remained silent, but in her head, there was a deafening roar. She reached out and picked up the ring. It was cold. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a bride. She was a survivor, standing in the wreckage of a life she had never truly known. Below, in the sanctuary, she could hear her sister calling her name, the sound of a family trying to find their way back together through the ruins of a perfect day. Evelyn Vance closed her eyes and let the ring drop into the shadows of the bell tower, watching it disappear into the dust. The fairy tale was dead, but for the first time in 18 months, she was breathing real air. The cathedral was no longer a house of God, it had become a house of evidence. Yellow crime scene tape now crisscrossed the mahogany pews, a jagged, neon contrast to the ancient stone and stained glass. The air was thick with the ozone of police radios and the metallic scent of suppressed panic. Evelyn Vance sat in the very back row, draped in a heavy, navy blue police windbreaker that felt like lead on her shoulders. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of a bright future, was now a tattered, dirty costume. One of her sleeves had torn during the chaos, and the lace hung like a broken wing. She stared at her hands, reddened and raw from where Arthur had gripped her. Agent Marcus Thorne approached her, carrying a thick manila folder. He looked at her with a mixture of professional detachment and genuine pity. He didn't offer words of comfort, he knew they would be useless. Instead, he offered the truth. "We've been tracking him for 3 years, Evelyn," Thorne said, sitting on the edge of the pew beside her. "We called him the architect because he never just committed a crime. He designed a life, lived it until the structural integrity was compromised, usually by the depletion of the victim's bank accounts, and then he demolished the evidence." He opened the folder. Evelyn didn't want to look, but her eyes were drawn to the glossy photographs like a moth to a flame. "This was Catherine," Thorne said, pointing to a beautiful blonde woman laughing on a yacht. "Arizona, 4 years ago. She drowned in a pool that had a faulty drainage system Arthur had personally repaired the week before. And this was Maria. Vermont. She died of carbon monoxide poisoning in a cabin Arthur had renovated to be perfectly airtight." Evelyn felt the bile rise in her throat. Each woman looked like her, not in features, but in spirit. They looked happy. They looked safe. They looked like they were standing in the center of a dream. "And you, Evelyn," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a low, grim rumble. "You were meant to be his masterpiece. Do you know where he was taking you for the honeymoon?" The Amalfi Coast, she whispered. He booked a private villa in Positano. He said it was the most romantic place on earth. Thorne pulled out a final sheet of paper, a blueprint. We found this in the trunk of his car, hidden beneath a false floor. It's not a villa in Positano. It's a remote estate in the Swiss Alps, accessible only by a single private road. The blueprints show a highly sophisticated ventilation system and a cellar with a door that only locks from the outside. He wasn't taking you to a honeymoon, Evelyn. He was taking you to a tomb. Outside, the world had turned into a circus. The news of a most wanted arrest at a high society wedding had leaked instantly. A swarm of reporters, paparazzi, and curious onlookers had gathered at the base of the cathedral steps, their cameras flashing like strobe lights in the deepening twilight. Arthur Sterling was being led out of the sacristy by 4 armed federal agents. He was shackled at the wrists and ankles, the heavy chain clinking rhythmically against the stone. Yet, even in the face of total ruin, he didn't hang his head. He walked with a terrifying, upright grace, his chin tilted up as if he were simply walking to a different kind of altar. As he reached the top of the steps, the crowd surged forward. The police line wavered. "Look at me, Arthur!" a reporter screamed. "Did you kill them?" Arthur ignored them, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was looking for a gap in the perimeter, a flaw in the design of his own capture. For a moment, his gaze snapped back toward the cathedral doors, catching Evelyn's eyes through the glass. He didn't scowl. He smiled, a small, knowing quirk of the lips that suggested this was all just part of a larger, more complex blueprint. The Great Escape didn't happen with a gunfight or a high-speed chase. It began with a distraction. Just as the agents reached the back of the armored transport van, a black SUV roared onto the cathedral plaza, jumping the curb and scattering the crowd. The driver didn't stop until the vehicle slammed into a parked police cruiser, the sound of crumpling metal echoing through the square. The agents instinctively turned, weapons drawn, toward the SUV. In that split second of diverted attention, Arthur Sterling moved. He didn't run for the SUV. He didn't try to fight the agents. Instead, he threw his entire weight against the agent holding his right arm, knocking the man off balance and into the open doors of the transport van. In the tangle of limbs and heavy gear, Arthur managed to do something impossible. He reached into the agent's belt and snatched a small, heavy object. Not a gun. A key. By the time the other agents had slammed him against the side of the van, Arthur was laughing. It was a dry, rattling sound that chilled Evelyn to the bone. "He's got a key!" Thorne shouted, seeing the flash of silver from the doorway. They pinned Arthur to the floor of the van, the weight of 3 men crushing the air from his lungs. They stripped the key from his hand, but as they dragged him back up, the architect whispered something into the ear of the nearest agent. Evelyn couldn't hear it, but she saw the agent's face turn pale. The agent looked back at the cathedral, then at Evelyn, with an expression of pure horror. Agent Thorne's radio crackled. "Thorne, we've got a problem. We just finished searching the bridal suite at the hotel where the reception was supposed to be." Thorne pressed the receiver to his ear. "What is it?" "It's not just blueprints in the car, sir. We found a timed incendiary device rigged to the gas main of the hotel ballroom. It was set to go off at 8 p.m. tonight. Right in the middle of the first dance." Evelyn heard the words. The room began to spin. 8 p.m. The first dance. She could see it, the music, the laughter, the champagne, and then the world ending in a roar of fire. He hadn't just planned to kill her in Switzerland. He had a secondary plan, a demolition of the entire guest list, a way to erase everyone who had ever seen his face. "He's a monster," she breathed, the realization finally breaking through the shock. "He's a builder," Thorne corrected grimly. "And builders always have a backup plan." As the van doors finally slammed shut on Arthur Sterling, the sirens began to wail again, but this time they were heading toward the hotel. The agents scrambled to their cars, leaving Evelyn standing on the steps of the cathedral. She watched the tail lights of the transport van disappear into the dark, rainy streets of the city. He was caught, yes. He was in chains. But as she looked down at the tattered lace of her dress, she realized that Arthur Sterling hadn't just tried to take her life. He had succeeded in destroying the person she used to be. The great escape wasn't his, it was hers. She had escaped the fire, but she was now standing in the ashes of a life that had never been real. Evelyn turned back toward the dark interior of the cathedral. Father Thomas was standing by the altar, snuffing out the candles one by one. The light was fading. The wedding was over. And for Evelyn Vance, the long, cold night of the truth was only just beginning. 6 months had passed since the bells of St. Jude's Cathedral had failed to ring. Evelyn Vance, though she was legally using her maiden name again, it felt like a borrowed garment sat on the porch of a small, weather-beaten cottage on the coast of Maine. The Atlantic Ocean churned before her, a relentless, gray expanse that mirrored the restless state of her own mind. The air here smelled of salt and decaying kelp, a sharp, honest bitterness that she preferred over the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive cologne. The wedding of the century, as the tabloids had dubbed it, was now a staple of true crime documentaries and late-night podcasts. They called him the Black Widow groom or the Bluebeard architect. They dissected her life, her choices, and her naivete with the clinical cruelty of an autopsy. But they didn't know the truth of the silence that followed. The legal proceedings in Chicago had been a circus of the macabre. Evelyn had been forced to sit only 20 feet away from Arthur Sterling for 6 weeks. He hadn't worn a tuxedo this time, he wore a cheap, orange jumpsuit that should have diminished him, but somehow didn't. He sat at the defense table with a legal pad, taking meticulous notes, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his court-appointed attorney with a faint, condescending smile. He didn't look like a man on trial for triple homicide and attempted mass murder. He looked like a professor grading a particularly disappointing thesis. When Evelyn took the stand, the silence in the courtroom was so absolute she could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. She had practiced her testimony 1,000 times, but when she looked at Arthur, the words turned to ash in her mouth. He wasn't looking at her with hatred. He was looking at her with pride. He wasn't looking for a wife, she told the jury, her voice thin but steady. He was looking for a canvas. He didn't love me. He loved the way he could shape me. He loved the design of our life together. I was just a structural element in a house of cards. Arthur had leaned back then, a slow, terrifyingly serene nod escaping him. It was a confirmation. She had finally understood his work. The jury didn't take long. Life without the possibility of parole. The architect was to be sealed away in a structure he couldn't redesign, a maximum security cell in Terre Haute. A week ago, a package had arrived at her cottage. It had no return address, just a postmark from Indiana. Agent Marcus Thorne had warned her that Arthur might try to reach out. Predators like him don't like to lose their audience, Thorne had said over the phone. They need the final word. They need to know they're still in your head. Evelyn had stared at the box for 3 days before opening it. Inside was not a letter, nor a threat. It was a small, perfectly scaled architectural model made of balsa wood and vellum. It was a model of the cottage she was currently living in. Every detail was exact: the sagging porch, the missing shingle on the roof, even the Adirondack chair where she drank her coffee. But there was one addition. In the model, the front door was wide open, and inside the tiny living room, a miniature figure stood by the fireplace. It was a figure of a man, carved with such precision that she could see the silhouette of a tuxedo. Underneath the model was a single strip of drafting paper with a line of elegant, slanted handwriting. A house is never finished, Evelyn. It only changes owners. I am always in the foundations. She had burnt the model in her fireplace that night, watching the balsa wood curl and blacken, but the message remained etched in her mind. He didn't need to be physically present to haunt her. He had built a room for himself in her psyche, and he had no intention of vacating. Before she had retreated to Maine, Evelyn had made one final trip back to St. Jude's. The cathedral was empty, the air still holding that ancient, limestone chill. Father Thomas was there, polishing the brass eagle of the lectern. He looked older, more fragile, as if the weight of the revelation had drained the last of his marrow. "I keep thinking about the what-ifs, Father," Evelyn said, standing in the aisle where she had almost lost her life. "What if you hadn't seen the news? What if you had just been a few minutes late? I would be in the Alps right now. I would be gone." Father Thomas stopped his polishing and looked at her. His eyes were no longer terrified, they were filled with a weary kind of grace. "Evelyn, we live in a world that focuses on the what-ifs of tragedy," he said softly. "But we rarely look at the what-ifs of providence. What if God put me in that prison 20 years ago just so I would recognize that face today? What if your heart was strong enough to survive the breaking so that you could finally see the light?" He walked over to her and took her hands. They were warm, unlike Arthur's. "The architect thought he was the one building your life," Thomas continued. "But he was wrong. He was just the storm that tested the house. You are the builder now. And you have the chance to build something that isn't a prison." Back on her porch in Maine, Evelyn picked up a pen. She wasn't an editor anymore, she couldn't stand the thought of fixing other people's stories. She had decided to write her own. She opened a fresh notebook. The first page was terrifyingly blank, a white void that represented the rest of her life. For 18 months, her story had been written by a man who saw people as materials, as wood, stone, and glass. He had tried to frame her into a tragedy, a beautiful corpse in a perfectly designed tomb. But he had failed. He was a master of structures, but he understood nothing of the soul. She looked out at the ocean. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. It wasn't perfect. It was chaotic, wild, and unpredictable. It was exactly what she needed. Evelyn began to write. "The priest stopped my wedding because he recognized my fiancé, and in that moment of ruin, I was finally set free. As the ink dried on the paper, the phantom weight of the lace and the pearls finally lifted from her shoulders. The architect was in his cell, surrounded by 4 walls of his own making. But Evelyn Vance was standing under a sky that had no ceiling. The wedding was over. The marriage was a lie. But for the first time in her life, the foundation beneath her feet was real." In a cold, sterile cell in Indiana, Arthur Sterling sat at a small metal desk. He was drawing. He didn't have his professional tools, no T-squares, no Rapido graph pens, just a standard issue golf pencil and the back of a legal form. But his hand was as steady as ever. He was drawing a cathedral. St. Jude's. He drew the arches, the buttresses, and the long, winding stairs of the bell tower. He drew the altar where he had stood in his charcoal tuxedo. And then, with a slow, deliberate stroke, he drew a tiny crack in the foundation of the front steps. He stared at the crack for a long time, a faint, ghost-like smile touching his lips. "Nothing is ever truly broken," he whispered to the empty cell. "It's just waiting for a renovation." He folded the paper into a perfect square and tucked it into the pocket of his jumpsuit. Outside, the sirens of the prison evening count began to wail, a sound he had learned to harmonize with. He closed his eyes and began to design his next masterpiece, a world where the walls were invisible, and the exits were always a part of the plan. But in a small cottage in Maine, Evelyn Vance didn't hear the sirens. She only heard the sound of the waves, and the scratching of a pen, as she built a life that no architect could ever tear down.